Thank you very much, Roy. What I wanted to talk about today was the relevance really of brands and politics. And maybe just to open up by saying it would be impertinent of me to speculate on how any of you may have voted at the last election. I'd be curious to know, but it would be impertinent to ask. But I suspect that many of you might have been attracted to what Tony Blair had on offer in 1997. Not necessarily because you were confirmed Labour voters or you were Tory switchers or whatever, but probably what was on offer in 97 for a whole range of reasons, and I'll come to that, was attractive. It was hopeful. It was about a kind of future in which we could all do well, not because of the family we were born into, but because of our own wits and living in a meritocratic society. And it was a very hopeful place. Indeed, I was then a newly elected Conservative Member of Parliament in 1997, and I was so convinced that 2 years later I joined the Labour Party in Parliament and crossed the floor of the House of Commons. The Labour Party convinced me by argument at that time. Now, in 2010, things have become very, very different. Labour lost the election, and everything I'm going to say over the next 20 minutes is not said as a bad loser. We lost, and arguably we deserved to lose. We had got into a bad relationship with the public, and I underline the word relationship because I think that's one of the most important things that those of us in politics, arguably anybody in any commercial enterprise too, but certainly in politics has to recognise you're in a relationship with the voter. It's not just about a series of announcements and the voter has to take it. The voter actually, at the end of the day, has the final say. And in 2010, they had the final say, and we lost. But the extraordinary thing about the election in 2010 was that whilst Labour lost and most people thought Labour was going to lose, the Tories actually didn't get a majority. And that was extraordinary because everybody thought they would. Everybody thought and had thought for some time that the Labour government was coming to the end of its time, and they were expecting the kind of result that we'd seen in 1979 when there was a sea change, when Margaret Thatcher came in, the kind of result that happened in 1997 when Tony Blair came in. And I think people expected, after 3 terms of Labour, that there would be a sea change election. It didn't happen. And in a sense, really, I put out at the beginning 3 questions. The first is, could the Labour brand have been renewed successfully while Labour was in office for that 2010 election? Secondly, why didn't the Tory brand prevail at that election so that they won a majority? Not a coalition with another political party, but an outright majority in the way that they had done in 1979, in the way that Blair did in 1997. And the third is about the character of the political brand that will prevail at the next election. Now, as I said, it was a very unusual election in 2010. People expected a sea change. It didn't happen. Inevitably, in a democracy, sooner or later, a government expires. There is a sense that you can do a number of things in office to renew your purpose, your brand, but in the end, people tire of you, they want change, you go, another party comes in. It's worth remarking, therefore, that in the 20th century, that actually meant that the Conservative Party were in office for 2 out of every 3 years of the entire century. There was a Conservative dominance, and one of the questions which is in my mind is, was that really a dominance of Conservative politics in the sense of regressive politics? And in the 21st century, may we now be seeing something which is about progressive politics being the dominant brand characterisation ahead of us? But the extraordinary thing about this election, as I say, was that the Tories didn't pull it off. Extraordinary because I think the Tories have been amazing masters of brand management. 1979, look at what Maurice Saatchi, Charles Saatchi, Gordon Rees, Tim Bell put together for a campaign which I think most people would recognise was a transformation of everything that had ever gone before. It was the most extraordinary coordination of communications, clarity, everything that you all recognise in relation to good brand management was what happened in 1979. A simple message communicated extremely effectively. It was repeated in 1983 and in 1987, and to some extent, when we brought Saatchi's back for the 92 election, when I'd left television then and I was then John Major's Director of Communications, I brought Morris back because it seemed to me that the most convincing thing about the Saatchis was they really understood brand management. They understood the discipline of brand management, and they understood that in a way that even in 1992, an increasingly savvy Labour Party still didn't quite get. But in 1997, the Labour Party had it in spades, and New Labour was, I think, the absolute quintessential example of brand management for that election. But it was more than that. The Tories have been about a premium brand in the 1980s. We now had Tony Blair, the embodiment of the brand, but we now had a brand that was very clearly a value brand. This was a brand which was going to make it available for everybody to enjoy in the fruits of our society. That was the hopeful nature of it. It was future-looking, it was forward-looking. It would be, if you like, smoked salmon for everybody. It would be about making sure that everyone would have access to good education, to literacy, the kind of tools that Mac was talking about that would push you up into that aspirational zone. We all wanted it. And even if you weren't a Labour voter in 97, very probably, as I did, and I was a Tory voter because I became a Tory Member of Parliament, I wanted everything the Labour Party was going to deliver. I wanted a minimum wage. I just actually was sceptical that the minimum wage wouldn't cost jobs. It turned out that it didn't cost jobs. Everybody at the bottom could get paid more. What was wrong was that? And that was part of my problem and why I crossed the floor, because why would I want to oppose something in which people at the bottom were able to start moving up the ladder and it wasn't costing jobs? And yet I was stuck in a party that wanted to go on actually opposing it. And I say that because I think that was the excitement about New Labour in 97. That was the brilliance of it. And to some extent, it wasn't only a value brand. It foreshadowed what would be what Mac was talking about with access brands. And that was the whole brilliance of that project. And of course, what went on to happen was the inevitable business of being in government. You accrue baggage, you accrue problems, you get disappointments, you make choices, some of them are bad. You end up becoming involved in a war with Iraq. You end up, as the public felt, who of course were in love with Tony Blair, they felt that they were betrayed by Tony Blair. And such, as Roy has often talked about, such was the high level of idealisation that when the inevitable denigration followed, it was just enormous. They hated Tony Blair. So that's why in 2005, Tony had to make the apology to the country. Look, I'm sorry I left you. And he brilliantly understood the importance of politics as a relationship. As he said, I've got myself into a place whereby I think I'm right, you think you're right, so I start shouting more loudly, you start speaking more slowly, and we end up disagreeing, and the crockery starts flying. And then from that we had the 5 years of Labour with 3 of those under Gordon, and we get to the 2010 election. So I understand why we lost. The extraordinary thing in all this, though, is what happened with the Tories. And I put that out again to you because when Michael Howard, as an example, William Hague before and Ian Duncan Smith became leader in the 2005 election, I think what we saw was a huge opportunity for the Tories to do what you should do with a brand, which is to decontaminate it, to reinvent it, reinvigorate it. But because of the leader they had, and again, the psychological concept of splitting here, in a sense, Michael Howard, Ian Duncan Smith, William Hague, all represented, I think, in the public's mind, the psychological concept of bad Tories. They represented the past. They represented all the things they'd wanted to get rid of in 97. But with Michael Howard gone and that nice, young, shiny David Cameron out there after the 2005 election, there was the good Tory on offer. And what we saw, I think, between 2005 and 2007 was the opportunities really coming through, and Cameron, to his credit, taking full advantage of it, decontaminating the brand, getting rid of the damaging negatives, slaying the dragons that have been a problem for the Tory party to get back into power. And at the same time, we saw this Tory party begin to think about what it might need to do for the future. So you saw Cameron talking about climate change. In comes Gordon Brown. There's an extraordinary moment for the Labour Party, when actually through the summer of 2007, people actually for some reason get quite optimistic, but then reality shapes in again, and then the recession. Now, I think there's an interesting moment of choice here in how the Tories approached this. How we approached it, clearly it was highly problematic, and the result was the result it was in 2010. But the Tories had a choice, and I think it's a very interesting question about how you manage a brand. They could have gone on with their modernisation, their reinvigoration, their reinvention, their decontamination, or they could do, and we all get tempted by this, don't we? They could do the opportunist thing. And I think that what Cameron did was really important in understanding the 2010 election back in 2007, which is he decided to ride the opportunist horse. The opportunist horse was to pick the recession, to take the deficit that would accrue, and say this was all Labour's fault. To actually get to a point whereby effectively their brand message at the 2010 election was entirely a grim one. We are all in this terrible hole together. We are the repairers. Only we can fix the terrible hole that Labour made. This terrible hole which is pulling the country down, from which I do not know if we can escape. Now, actually, he pedalled alongside that, the big society. Nobody much believed in the big society. They didn't really get it. But they did hear the message about the deficit, and they stuck with that. And I think what's interesting is that it wasn't in any shape or form inspirational. It didn't do what Thatcher did in 79 or what happened with Blair in 97. It therefore missed the sea change opportunity that he absolutely held in his hands. He had a 10, 15-point opinion poll lead for months and months and months. And the public were baffled. What was this brand? I mean, it's an incredibly unattractive thing, isn't it? Which is that I want to vote for you because you're telling me, and it's back to what Max said. In fact, the phrase Cameron used was age of austerity. We are going to have an age of austerity. Come vote for it. Well, it's quite confusing because on the one hand, a bit of you says, yes, I think it is all very bad out there. But another bit says, yeah, but do I want to vote for it? Do I want this to be my future? And we are now in that place. Now, the interesting thing is that I think that the result, clearly through the Tories, they didn't know what to do. Now, again, Cameron's credit, great opportunist. And I say that with some admiration because opportunism is necessary as a political tool in politics. But what did he do? He reached out for the Liberals. The Liberals who had campaigned, and think about the Liberals. The Liberal brand in this election was extraordinary. A brand which really wasn't properly on the table before. Suddenly, as a result of a reality show, the general election debates, that was what we had, a reality TV show. This celebrity emerges in our celebrity culture. For a few weeks, we all behave as we do with the X Factor and all these other things. We latch onto it. Nick Clegg, he's wonderful. We want Nick Clegg. It's so exciting. We behave like kind of adoring finalists, people, on the X Factor. The public behaved like that. They became groupies for the whole thing. And there was Nick out there promising new politics, all going to be different with me. You remember the advert? He did the PPB with all the rubbish on the floor. Politicians, broken promises, that's the old politics. No more broken promises. That's what the Liberal Democrats are about. We promise you that we will not allow tuition fees to be raised. We promise you that we'll stop VAT from happening. This is the new politics. We'll keep our promises. And by the way, our biggest promise to you is we'll keep Cameron out of Downing Street if you vote us in. And within 5 days, they've become a bit like the kind of, drunk at the bar who's been through AA. They become the enabler. They buy the man the drink. They actually put Cameron into Downing Street. And if you want to understand why I think the hatred of Nick Clegg is so strong, it's back to the model of Tony Blair in Iraq and idealisation and denigration, and the speed with which Clegg moved is why the public responded in the way that they did. That being said, they have enabled Cameron to form a government. They have enabled the programme of austerity to take place. They have enabled this extraordinary programme of cuts to take place. And I think the interesting thing about this now is that we're in a place in which people don't understand the brand. What is the Tory brand? Now, I'll come on to us in a moment at the Labour Party, but what is this brand? I mean, people knew in 1979 what Thatcher was about. And actually, again, huge credit to the woman, she actually really understood about access brands quite early on, didn't she? Selling off council houses, enabling the people at the very bottom to buy shares in British Telecom, British Gas. I mean, one of the reasons I think people feel so strongly about her, and I know there are people who don't like her, but I think one of the reasons that people feel so strongly, and even if they don't like her, they respect her, was that she had a degree of conviction and character which was extraordinary. Blair was much in the same mould. I think it's a harder order to say that of some of the other people who've been prime ministers in the same time frame. Certainly not as felt. It may be unfair to say that, but in the case of Thatcher and Blair, that was out there. So where is, in what should have been a sea change election, this conviction and character issue now? You need competence to play in politics. That's your permission, that's your passport. But it's the conviction and the character that becomes critical. It was the problem for Gordon Brown. People questioned his character, people questioned his conviction. I think unfairly, but that's what they did. Politics is unfair. In that relationship, they questioned it. David Cameron's got something of the same problem. They think he's smooth, they think he's perfectly okay, but then they're not quite sure. So instead of Teflon Tony, you get kind of a sense of Cameron's very smooth bit, but smooth not Teflon, smooth more like slippery. In fact, and we've done some interesting work with voters out there, one of the things they say is, look at the way he's treated poor Nick. This is the guy who helped him get in. He couldn't get in on his own, couldn't get in with his Tory party, but that nice Liberal Democrat man who sold up all his principles to help him get in, look at what he's doing to poor Nick now. And it's interesting that women voters actually seem to feel that even more strongly than anybody else. And there is a sense of, what's it all for? Where's it all going? Where will we be at the end of all this? There's fear out there. And the politics of fear is becoming almost government of fear. So, for example, if you're over 50, you're absolutely terrified about what's going to happen to your mum and dad. And the whole crisis over care homes at the moment plays into a real worry we've all got, which is what the hell is going to happen to us when we're old? What's going to happen to my mum and dad? What's going to happen to me? And if you've got kids, I mean, I've got teenagers, you were talking about that earlier. What's going to happen to them? You know, if they're nice middle-class kids like mine, are they going to be able to manage university? Will they be able to help with the fees? Will I be able to help with the fees? If they're at the bottom of the pile, education maintenance allowance has been scrapped. They probably can't even afford to stay on at school. And for all of them, how the hell are they going to get on the housing ladder? So the interesting thing about Cameron's operation is that he ought to be being an access brand. He ought to be being a kind of premium brand offering smoked salmon for everybody. But actually, he's not even offering them the crumbs at the end of the Tesco counter. He's kind of saying, some of you are going to have to starve. Because you see, what I think they've become by default is a survival brand. And it's a survival of the fittest. And it's a kind of message out there that, you know, says, and some of you won't get a home. Some of you won't get looked after when you're older. Some of you won't get an education. That's the way it is. It's survival. It's the way of the fittest. And I think it's really unattractive. It's not hopeful. It's not future-looking. It's not forward-looking. But the age of austerity, if Cameron gets his way, is to make us all think there is no alternative. And I think we're all, in one way or another, struggling with whether or not we want to accept that there is no alternative to that, to the future. So I'm curious about where the Tory brand goes. From the Labour Party's point of view, it's really hard after you've been in government for 13 years to suddenly the next day turn around and say, that was all wrong, this is what we do now, because it's simply not credible. You know, up until a year ago, we were arguing a whole host of policies. Some of them I think were quite good, some of them were not so good. But the fact of the matter is, we had fallen out of our relationship with the public. They weren't listening to us anymore, so we shouted slightly more loudly and they started throwing crockery back in the end they said, get out, and we had to get out. We've got to work our way back into a relationship with the public. We've got to understand they're in control, not us. We have to understand that on issues like immigration, which the public care deeply about, it's not actually so much about how many great policies you've got, because again, as Roy and I have been discussing over the last year or two, if people reach a position through an emotional route, no amount of rational argument is going to actually make them see sense. It's not about seeing sense, it's about actually people feeling you understand what they feel. And we just simply burden them with more policies, more rational discussion. And they weren't in for a rational discussion. They wanted us to understand them. And the more we said rational things, the more they felt we didn't understand. Similarly with waste. No matter how much we did, the country felt we were wasting money. And we didn't seem to recognise that. Now we need to convince the country in our relationship that we've got the point. We need to understand that. We need to understand, for example, when it comes to banking, that people need to feel safe with their savings. Now, it's extraordinary to me that this government has come in and 1 year later we still haven't got a new wall erected between retail banking and investment banking, because it still leaves the public out there in this climate of fear, worrying about their savings. Will they be there this time next year if there's another banking crisis? And there might be, they read in the newspapers. So the fear goes on, and Labour somehow has got to rework itself. And I don't know, and maybe you have much better instincts about this than I do, I don't know how we shape our brand. I don't know whether we should be the all-singing, all-dancing, full-access brand for the next election. And how would we go about that? Maybe that would be, as we have with Sure Start, in terms of talking to younger people, an extraordinary project of Home Start. Now, I don't know how that would work itself out. It would have to be not an extravagant claim, because we can't clearly afford extravagant claims. But maybe we at least need to help people recognise that they can get into your higher aspirational fields, Matt. Because at the moment, the drive is to just drive you down into the regressive field. If you like, they came along and did the repair work, and now we're going to push you down. And you better recognise that that's really where your future is. Now, what Labour, I think, has to do is show it doesn't have to be like that. But it's got to be done in a way that's credible for people, that they genuinely think, I can see how I might fit into that and how I can be helped. But I suspect it's more than an access brand, and therefore, just as Blair in '97 was a value brand that foreshadowed access brands to come, we have to be an access brand seeing something of the future, and I don't know what that future bit is. Another thing that I think, and the final bit really I want to say, is in a general election in our country, because we're a parliamentary democracy, there are simple first past the post majorities. 60 Labour seats, 60 Conservative seats are held with majorities of less than 2,000 people apiece. What's extraordinary to think about, therefore, is that probably at the next election, which I think will be the sea change election, 120,000 people of a population of 60 million will determine the future. And I think they will determine the future between staying in that regressive territory, which is where I think the brand that the Tories inadvertently, by default, have ended up creating for themselves, for the few and not the many, or whether or not actually we can still be hopeful for the future and see ourselves looking at the future, moving towards a progressive future for the many and not the few. It's a very difficult challenge, and if anybody wants to be helpful in the coming years, we'll take your names at the end of the session. Thank you very much.